Good afternoon. I want to thank the Middle East Institute and Kate Seeley for inviting me to participate on such a distinguished panel. I've learned a lot so far, and it's great to be here with you. I was asked to assess Israel's concerns and calculations given the changes unfolding in the region over the last 11 months. Obviously, this is a challenging task because Israel's assessments are not static. They're constantly evolving, and they're subject to intense debates within the government and also other people outside of the government trying to influence the policy debate in Israel. It's also more challenging because Kate told me that I only have 10 minutes to explain all of this, but I'll do my best here. Obviously, Israel was shocked and threatened by the uprisings that started in Tunisia and spread to Egypt, Bahrain, Syria, and elsewhere. Israel had a strong stake in the old order, not because it enjoyed cooperating with autocrats, but because the region before January 2011 allowed Israel to operate in a fairly well-defined and predictable strategic environment. It had strong military cooperation and political cooperation with its two neighbors, Egypt and Jordan. It had stability on the Syrian border. It enjoyed a strong deterrent against the Assad regime, which even withstood an Israeli bombing against a Syrian nuclear reactor in 2007. Israel's use of force was relatively unconstrained. We saw that again in Syria, but also in Gaza as well. And despite some policy differences with the United States, primarily over the Palestinian issue and policy towards Iran, Israel had confidence in a US-led security order in the Middle East. Now, despite the initial shock that Israel felt and the fear that gripped many people in Israel, many people in the government, so far, the Israeli government has been able to navigate the regional changes with limited damage to its strategic interests. It has still maintained the peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan. It recently brokered a prisoner exchange agreement helped by the Egyptian government or the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. The UN bid for recognizing the Palestinian state has been stalled. Relations with Turkey are obviously not great, but have been stabilized over the last couple of months. And there hasn't been a direct increase in terror attacks as a result of the uprisings and the events over the last several months. But while Israel has been able to manage these short-term challenges, its long-term prognosis looks extremely threatening and complex. It faces diplomatic isolation and a diplomatic offensive, primarily in Europe, but in other parts of the world as well. It still faces a significant threat from rocket attacks, both in Gaza, but also Hezbollah rockets that are aimed at Israel. And obviously, its primary security concern is the Iranian nuclear challenge. It's these long-term uncertainties and combination of conventional and asymmetric threats which drive Israeli strategic calculations and policymaking, which seeks to preserve as much of the old order as possible while preparing for the new. So I want to mention and discuss the four key drivers of uncertainty, the four key actors that affect Israel's strategic thinking and its strategic outlook, which contribute to this uncertainty. The first is Egypt. Obviously, Egypt has been the pillar of Israel's security strategy in the Middle East for the last 30 years. Let's not forget that between 1948 and the signing of the Camp David Agreement, Israel and Egypt fought 5 wars, and that last war in 1973 was extremely devastating. The scars, to some degree, are still felt in Israel. That peace treaty removed the main conventional military threat against Israel. So far, the SCAF is obviously still in control in Israel, in Egypt, maybe in Israel. Still in control, still cooperating closely with the Israeli government. They played a crucial role in the prisoner exchange deal. They have been arresting militants in the Sinai Peninsula that are active in terrorist attacks against Israel and have been sabotaging the gas pipeline between Egypt and Israel. But despite this ongoing cooperation, the relations are precarious. There's a realization in Israel that Egypt is just at the beginning of a long power struggle between the military and popular political forces, which will likely change Egypt in the future. There's a real fear that an antagonistic, nationalist, or Islamic-led government could change the nature of Egyptian-Israeli military and political cooperation. there's a fear of a security vacuum in the Sinai that could open up another front on Israel's southern border. And there's a realization that a different kind of Egyptian government could also constrain Israel's use of unilateral force in Gaza in particular. Looking at that picture more broadly, there's a real question within Israeli military circles of whether Israel needs to readapt its defense needs to fight a conventional war on its southern border in the future, which has real significant implications for Israel's defense spending and planning. Moving on to Syria, the Assad regime has provided stability and predictability on the border as well for the last 4 decades. There's a real debate going on in Israel now about the interest that Israel has in an Assad regime. Amos Gilad, a senior defense official, just a couple of days ago, argued that Israel does have an interest in maintaining the Assad regime. The question is it better, from an Israeli perspective, to live with a predictable Assad or to take the risk of the unknown, of what could come in Assad's wake? The other side of that debate asks whether it's worth the risks of a different kind of regime in Syria in order to potentially break the strategic relationship between Syria and Iran. So what are these risks that the Israelis are considering in terms of a different kind of regime in Syria? Obviously, they're afraid of a Sunni militant or Islamic-led regime that could potentially change the nature of Israeli-Syrian relations, a regime that might not respect Israel's deterrence in the same way that the Assad regime has. Potentially weak state could also emerge in Syria. If you remember, in the 1950s and the 1960s, the Golan Heights and the Syrian border were the site of many cross-border attacks against Israel, many infiltrations, and there's a fear in Israel that a weak central government in Syria could resume this state of affairs where there's a number of cross-border operations against Israel. And obviously, there's a fear that Syria could become the site of a proxy battle between external forces in the region. Beyond Syria, there's the question of Turkey, which has been very problematic for Israel. The Turkish-Israeli strategic relationship over the last several decades has been very important for Israel. It gave Israel strategic depth in the region and beyond. And there's a real question, obviously, about the future of Turkey, about whether Turkey is promoting Islamic political parties and movements in the Arab world, and Syria in particular. There are questions about how Turkey-Iranian relations will develop. And there's a question of whether Turkey will actually seek to undermine Israeli interest more directly than they have in the past, as some Israelis may argue. All of these questions obviously contribute to the great uncertainty in Israeli policymaking circles. But the most important issue facing Israel, and the most important issue contributing to the uncertainty that Israel faces, is the United States and U.S. policy in the region. The Middle East region, Israel's strategic environment, is becoming more complex precisely at a time when U.S. leadership in the Middle East is perceived to be wavering, and the U.S. ability to manage these transitions is declining, as Dr. Abdalla also described. This outlook for the U.S. position in the Middle East is deeply concerning for many Israelis, and they question U.S. strategic judgment in the region on a number of issues. They question whether the U.S. is willing to exert the kind of pressure on Iran which is necessary to actually force a change in the Iranian pursuit of nuclear weapons. They feel that U.S. pressure to push out President Mubarak in January of 2011 really jeopardized the regional balance of power and undermined the regional strategic order that the United States has helped promote. They fear that U.S. influence is declining and that the United States is no longer able to shape and influence decisions and events and trends in the region. And they see regional foes and allies of the United States much more willing to contradict U.S. positions, to stake out more independent positions against the United States. This is extremely significant because Israel and the United States are so closely linked, both politically and militarily. A constrained United States weakens Israel's deterrence and power projection and has significant ramifications for Israel's long-term security. So looking forward, the uncertainty that has developed in the region over the last several months makes it more difficult for Israeli policymakers to actually formulate strategies and policies. Israelis see and believe that they have a limited ability to shape and influence their own strategic environment. They see a constant and wide-ranging series of threats which must be constantly managed and managed over time. And they're preparing for a long period of instability and uncertainty. So where does that leave them? Many people would argue that Israel needs to come up with a proactive, bold initiative that would strengthen its relations in the region and more globally, that they need to meet these new regional dynamics with a new way of thinking and a new strategy. Some people in Israel have called for a stronger commitment to resume Israeli-Palestinian negotiations to mitigate some of these challenges, and called for Israel to strengthen its relationships with its Arab neighbors. I would agree that that would be the logical approach and probably the approach that would strengthen Israel over time. But I think there's very little appetite, both in Israel and within the Palestinian Authority and Hamas as well, for a serious negotiation or the kind of serious negotiations that would require compromises that could lead to an agreement. I think rather than expecting these creative policies and a proactive strategy, Israel's approach now is to preserve as much of the status quo as possible by not taking any strategic decisions that could undermine Israeli security as long as the regional map remains so uncertain. Thank you.
Thank you very much.